This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
All right, good evening, everybody. I want to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting today on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend those respects to all Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples here present today. And welcome to the Brotherton Lecture. So my name is Daniel Bennett and I'm delighted to welcome you this evening. A little bit of context. The Brotherton Lecture was established in honour of Dr. Patricia Leslie Brotherton, a dedicated lecturer in the Department of Psychology who passed away in 1979. Her generous bequest supports both this lecture series and the Brotherton Fellowship. The lectures become a valued tradition in our school, bringing outstanding researchers from around the world to share their knowledge and ideas with our community. In that context, it's my pleasure to welcome tonight's speaker, Professor Elliot Ludvig. So Professor Elliot Ludvig studies how people and other animals learn to make decisions, particularly in situations involving risk, reward, and uncertainty. So his work brings together psychology, neuroscience, and computational modelling to understand how learning shapes behaviour and influences the kinds of choices that we make every day. His research explores topics including gambling, habits, curiosity, delayed rewards, decision-making under uncertainty, timing, effort, etc., etc., etc. Through this work, Professor Ludvig aims to better understand why people sometimes make risky choices and how behavioural science can be used to reduce harm and improve outcomes. So in tonight's lecture, are sports betting apps designed to keep you hooked, or some variant of? Professor Ludvig will explore how sports betting has changed with the rise of online apps. He's going to discuss how features such as in-play betting, instant cash-out options, and seamless transactions can influence behaviour and encourage continued engagement. And he's also going to examine how the things we know from behavioural science can help reduce gambling-related harm through safer gambling messages and a better understanding of how people respond to betting environments. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. So the presentation will run for around about 45 minutes, followed by audience questions. So please hold your questions until the Q&A session at the end of the lecture. The lecture is being audio recorded and a recording will be emailed to all registered attendees after the lecture. And following the lecture, we will invite you to join us for refreshments in the foyer. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Elliot Ludvig.
Okay, well, I am still very excited to be here this evening to tell you about sports betting apps and some of the ways that they get you involved and some of the ways that they keep you around and get you to spend perhaps more money than you might ordinarily have wanted to. Now, sports betting is a big business. It has become a huge business. Annually, around the world, it's estimated that around $1.7 trillion are bet on legal sports betting sites, which translates to about $5 billion a day around the world that's being spent. And the market has exploded in the last few years, right? So the market used to be about 50 billion, the total market share that was available. Now it's grown 2.5 times over the last 15 years. It's projected to get up to close to 200 billion, but the current size at about $120 billion, that's just a really big number. So to get a sense of just how big and how all over the place the gambling industry, the sports betting industry has become, you can imagine that it's very similar actually in size to the global size of the potato industry. That's how big it's become. So you can imagine all the economy around potatoes, from French fries to everything else, right? That is how big the gambling industry has become. Really a behemoth in that sort of way. Now, it has become a really big industry, but part of the way that the industry makes money, of course, is that people lose money while gambling. That's effectively how they make money. Now, for many people, in fact, for most people, that's not really a problem, right? They can lose a little bit, they have fun, it's under control, it's okay. But for some people, it translates into harm. And there's a certain proportion, in fact, the current estimates in different countries, including the UK and Australia, is that somewhere on the order of 2 to 4% of the entire population are suffering from some form of gambling harm, not specifically sports related, but in general. And that number gets even higher when you start to think about people who place sports bets. And that can go up to about 8, 10, or even 14% is the estimate of the proportion of people who are engaged with these activities who end up coming to some sort of harm. And these harms are all sorts of different harms, right? So you have, some ways, the most obvious harms are the financial harms. People lose more money than they can afford, therefore they have difficulty in making making ends meet and making the payments that they need to make. It can be social harms where it ruins relationships. It could be well-being harms where they develop various types of mental health difficulties associated with it. And so there's lots of different types of things that go along with the growth of this industry. And that sort of balance is something that is very, very important to establish. Okay, so the part of how the industry has grown is that there really has been a transformation in the type of sports betting that exists. So it used to be the case that to place a sports bet, you would have to go to a particular location, right? You'd have to go to a place. You might make a phone call in some instances, but typically you would have to engage with a human and go there and place a bet. Right? And there was a limit to how much you can do that. There was a limit in the places you could do it, right? In America, you can only go to basically Las Vegas and some of Atlantic City that you can do it. In other places, you could go to casinos or bookies in order to be able to do it. But there was a limit, right? It was very finite in terms of how often and how you can do it. And that entirely transformed with the rise of smartphones and the rise that every single person in the room, I suspect, I don't because I put mine away, but every single other person in the room has a phone and really has a casino in their pocket, right? They have the opportunity. You can all right now pull out your phones and place a bet on any match that you want. Right, you can put a bet on any sort of sporting activity, a wide range of different types of activities. So there's been this real explosion in terms of the accessibility, the availability, and the other thing that's happened is it's also been transformed in terms of the types of engagement that you can get, because it's no longer that you have to go to a place and you can place a bet and you wait to the end of the event and then you collect your winnings or you have lost, right? Now, while it's ongoing, you can place a lot more bets, right? The types of things, the types of products that are available have increased, right? You can do in-play betting. You can bet on the event as it's going on. You can bet on micro events within the event. You can bet on who's going to get the next yellow card or who's going to get the next corner, right? So all of these things have really transformed the type of activity of what gambling actually is. And so the way this works is that there are many things that we as people have. There's different types of cognitive biases that many of us are subject to. Even when we're aware of them, we're often subject to them. And a lot of things that happen within gambling products, within the gambling industry, tap into those, right? Whether advertently or not, they certainly do. And what I want to do today is I want to step through some of those and some of the ways that those sorts of cognitive biases and psychological biases predispose us to some of the things that are in the gambling environment. So one of the reasons that we feel that gambling is, and many of us do, that gambling is all over the place, is the extent to advertising that we see. The advertising is all over the place. You see it in betting shop windows, right? So when you have in places where you have betting shops, they have advertising in the windows. The fact that there is a betting shop in the first place is an advertisement in and of itself. You see it on sports jerseys, right? You see sponsorship all over the place, right? All the sports teams are advertised like that. You see it within the stadia, right? You see it on the sideline hoardings. You see it on courtside, right? Again, everywhere you're walking, you see these different types of advertisements for it. And they're not just generic advertisements, right? They will often be very specific. So you might see it online, and you see things online which will be like specific special offers, right? There'll be enhanced odds. There'll be free bets, right? The different types of things trying to get you to be more likely to place a bet altogether, or if you're someone who already likes to place bets, perhaps be more likely to go to visit their operation. And so these things are not random, right? The types of ads and the types of offers that are made and that are advertised are not random, or they don't appear to be random, but they often seem to have certain types of patterns. And so one of those patterns seems to tap into a psychological bias that's known as representativeness. So to get there, I want everybody to read an example. And here's a famous example. This is from Kahneman and Tversky from the 1970s. Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2001, I believe, for his work on discovering many of the types of biases that we exhibit. This is one of them. And so this is a story of Linda, who's a 31-year-old, single, outspoken, very bright, majored in philosophy. You could read it for yourself. And then the question is, what is more probable? Is it more probable that she is a bank teller, or is it more probable that she's a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement? And so some of you may have a feeling as to which one of these is more probable. Some of you may have already figured out a little bit of the trick that's involved. But when you ask people this, and people have done this, especially when you do it separately and you ask them to judge the probability separately, you get a much higher estimate that it feels much more probable that the combination is something that is true. Now we know mathematically that's impossible, right? Because if you're two things, right, all the people who are one thing, right, all feminist bank tellers are necessarily bank tellers, and the non-feminist ones are as well, right? But the combination of things, these common combinations, feel more likely. And people have done experiments looking at exactly that sort of thing, and people will judge that sort of, and that's known as representativeness, the idea that it's more representative of what you expect. And we see that also in the sports betting world, especially in advertising. And so this was a study that was done a few years ago looking at the types of ads that were put out around the 2014 World Cup. And so here's an example of the type of ads that were looked at. These are the types of things that you see quite regularly, where it'll be put up something like England to beat Italy 2-0. Right? And now, so England winning a game, that feels like something could happen to some people. Others might not believe that. A 2-0 score is quite common. 2-0, right, is a very common outcome. And it feels like that's possible. That could happen, right? But it's actually really, really improbable, right? They do the same thing with the people who are going to score in the game, right? So they'll often pick the top goal scorer. Kane would be the top goal scorer. And use that, right, that he should be the first one to score a goal. How often is he the first one to score a goal? That's a different question, right? But it feels like, well, if somebody's going to score the first goal, it's probably going to be the top player. So what this study did, this is a colleague of mine, Philip Newell from University of Bristol, and he looked at all sorts of ads, both in TV and on shop windows, and essentially found that there was very little advertising for straight-up games, right? They didn't have, right, England to win. That was never the types of ads that they put out there. They always put in these sorts of common combinations, right? It would be England to win 2-0, Kane to score first and England to win, right? All the different types of combo bets that felt more probable but were actually a lot less likely to happen. And that was the sort of thing that people get drawn into, right? That it feels like, oh yeah, that could happen. I should put a bet, right? I could put a bet on that, and the odds are always a nice odd in that case. We've also looked at, and this is a study that I did with Philip later on, looking at what people actually want to bet on. And to take advantage of that, and one of the challenges actually working in our field is often we don't really have that much access to the operator data, right? So we don't have access to what the gambling companies know about. We're working a little bit from the outside, which makes a challenge, but we try and work around that anyways. And so for this study, what we did is we actually took advantage. There was a product for a while called Request a Bet. And that was on Twitter, where you can actually go out there and you can, this is before you can make every combination of everything like you can now. And you would ask a gambling company to make a bet of some sort, right? And they would come back to you and tell you, okay, here's the bet, here are the odds, use this code, and you can place a bet on our website or through our app. And for that, we were looking to see what type of bets were people requesting. And again, we were expecting, you see a lot of them. It was often the top goal scorer or something like that, right? And so, for example, that's a picture of Harry Kane in his Bayern Munich uniform. Last year, Harry Kane scored 60 goals for Bayern Munich in all competitions, which is a tremendously large number, the 8th highest ever. And so you might think, if you think, oh, who's going to score a goal for Bayern Munich? It's going to be Harry Kane. But it turns out, actually, that's only about a third of their total goals. That means it's 2/3 of the time somebody else is scoring for them, but you don't think that, right? You think, and the more common thing is you think, oh, of course it's going to be the top player. And so we looked at the types of bets people were looking at, and it was always the case that they were looking for those common combinations. And so they were often looking for the top teams, and they would often be looking for the top scorer on that top team. That was the common combination. That felt representative. That felt like the one that could hit, and was the one that you were most likely to put a bet on. And so people were falling into this representativeness trap of trying to get the bets on the things that felt like were more probable, even though they're actually not all that probable in terms of real-world outcomes. So that's one angle, and one of the types of things that we see in the gambling space. The other thing that we've seen introduced, and this is very much a change since the transformation and since the transition into very smartphone-based betting, is you see the introduction of lots of new types of products. And these products sometimes can actually lead to draw in more people and perhaps to get you to gamble more than you might have otherwise. And so one example of this, and Daniel mentioned this in the introduction, of course, is instant cash out, right? And so this is something that really only could exist since the advent of the phone. So now, instead of placing a bet on a game, right, you can place a bet on a game, and then partway through the match, if you don't like the way that it's going, or if you do and you want to cash in early, you can take your money at any point in time. And what that does is it conveys lots of different, it's different than a regular bet. First of all, it feels a little bit safer, right? Because you feel that you can change your mind, right? It feels like you're a little bit more in control than you might be otherwise. It gives you a degree of flexibility. It also keeps you more engaged, right? Because you're now, at any point in time, your bet is still live. It's active, right? It's not a ticket that you're holding in your hand that might pay out at the end of the game. It's something you could push a new button and change it, right? Change the pathway of what you're going to win or lose through the game. So here's an example, and it's an example for the locals. So in the recent World Cup, Australia played Turkey in one of the matches, and if you had placed a bet on that at $2, you could have gotten 6-to-1 odds on that game, and it would have paid out $12 at the end of the game. If you had then right away, before the game even started, cashed out that bet, you would have gotten back $1.90 from your $2. So actually there's already a 5% cut, right? Immediately if you decide to cash out. So in the cash out product is already telling you a little bit about how it makes money for the company, because they made money off your initial bet, and then they make an additional little bit of money on the second part of your bet if you decide to cash out. So that's the initial bet. If you remember the game, Australia scored, and then they scored again, and they were winning 2-0. So this is about the 75th minute of the game, about 3/4 of the way through, and so they're winning 2-0. And if you looked at that point, you would have gotten a cash out offer at $10.15, which is about 85% of the value of your now. You can take that, and then that's it. It's over. It doesn't matter if they end up winning or losing or drawing or whatever happens. You can take that at that point in time. Now, of course, there is probably more than an 85% chance of them winning at that stage, and they did go on to win, right? So you're giving up part of your expected value in doing that as well. And so that's just an example of how this sort of product plays out in reality in these sorts of things. Now, to understand these products, one of the things that we like to do, and this is something that I've done in collaboration with Daniel and his lab, his team, in terms of trying to understand these products, sometimes what we want to do is we want to bring it into the lab and do an experiment with it. And to do that, to really understand it, we need to have control over the different variables, right? And so it's a little different than when you're out there in the wild, right? And you don't have control over what team is going to score when and what's going to happen, right? You can't really do experiments in the same sort of way. So we're trying to get at the psychological mechanism. What's behind it? Why are people engaging with this sort of product? And so to do that, we developed a version of the task which is based on cards. And it has the same properties as the real cash out, except it's much more controlled. We can determine the probabilities. We can determine when it changes, what the cash out offers are, right? We have all the full control that you would want in a true kind of scientific experimental context. So in this case, you would put a bet on either red cards or blue cards. The cards would appear, there'd be more red or more blue, and the game would end when one of the cards was selected, and you'd either win or lose on that round. And typically in the middle of that round, the way that we do it is we would give you a cash out offer on the basis of the cards that are out there, right? So you'd see what the odds are. You can see if you're winning or losing at that point. We'd make you an offer, and you could decide whether or not to take that offer. That's the nature of the game that we have set up. So first thing that I want to point out is that we had people play this game in two different versions. In one version, we had the cash out available version of the game, right? And that meant that every round that they played, they knew that they would be able to get a cash out. And in other rounds, there was no cash out. So it was the exact same game, the same card betting game, except there was never any cash out available. And we did this a couple different times where once it was half the people with it and half the people without. We also did a version where, on some rounds you had it and on some rounds you didn't. And no matter how we did it, it didn't matter. There was a significant increase in the amount that people were willing to bet. And it was a substantial increase on the order of 30–35%, more that people were willing to bet when they had that cash out available. And so that indicates, again, how these new products, right, are getting you perhaps to bet more than you might ordinarily have. And this is in the front end. This is just knowing that you have cash out available. It's like, oh, well, this feels better, perhaps. It feels safer. Now, the other thing about it is that it doesn't affect everybody equally. And so this is looking at who then uses the cash out. And so it turns out what we looked at we used one of these indices to look at how much at risk different people are for gambling harm. And so from left to right there, it's people who have virtually no risk, people who almost never gamble, versus those who are classified as potentially problem gamblers who gamble a lot and have experienced types of gambling harm. And the cash out frequency is much higher amongst the novices, right? The people who don't actually gamble all that much are actually the ones who use this product the most. And what that suggests is it's pushing in the way as possibly something towards a gateway product, right? The idea being that this is something that actually appeals to those who are least likely to be gambling in the first place, right? So it's bringing in the new people, right? And you can make sense, right? If you think about it, right? Here's this product which makes gambling feel a little bit safer, right? A little bit, you're still more in control. It's a little bit more flexible, right? And so to those who aren't really gamblers, it feels like, oh, actually, I can do this, right? And take that step into that sort of space. And that's what we see in terms of the usage. We also try to ask the question, and one of the other questions we try and get at, as I said, we're doing this experiment to try and understand a little bit more about why people cash out. And I've suggested a few different things, a few different possible motivations as to why that can be the case. And so here I'm going to unpack one of them. And so in this case, we're going to look at the possibility of control. Right? The idea being that one of the things that matters and one of the things you have in cash out is the sense of control. That you can decide later what you want to do and what type of bet you want to have, perhaps the types of wins and losses that you're going to encounter. You have control over that. And so to do that, we did an experiment where we had two different types of cash out. We had our regular cash out, but then we also created this thing, and this is with my PhD student Andrew, who's sitting over there in the blue shirt. So we created a version of the task where the cash out was automatic. So it was the exact same thing as the cash out product, except now you didn't get to choose whether or not to use it. Right? So one of the times we did it, in the example I'm using here, it was pre-programmed how often it was going to accept the cash out. Other times we actually based it on your previous behavior. So we would observe your using of the cash out and then program the computer to do exactly what you would have done in the cash out situations, right? So, and the people knew that. It was meant to be like them. Despite that, you end up with a big difference where people who, when cash out is available, same sort of thing, they're much more willing to place a bet, much bigger, a larger bet. And the automatic case was, in this case, not much higher than the unavailable. In this case, it was indistinguishable. A couple other times, it was a little bit better than not having it at all. But in general, having that sort of cash out, when you could control it, right? And so it wasn't just about the returns and the outcomes that you were getting. It was also about having the sense of control as to when you can actually choose your bet. Okay, so that was a couple of examples of lab experiments that we've done in this space. And now I want to kind of touch on it, bring it back a little bit to the real world and bring it back to the types of things that we're talking about in terms of sports betting. But I'm going to take a step in the middle, and I'm going to first go to horse race betting, which is, I guess, a type of sports betting, but it's in that same sort of space. And so for this one, we did an experiment where this was meant to be a little bit more realistic. And so we had people come in, and we designed a interface which was a horse racing interface, okay? And so people could come in, and they could place bets on a horse race, like one would, real set of bets on a horse race, with real money that they actually won or lost on the basis of what happened in this horse race. We had a video of a archived horse race, a historic horse race, which was redubbed, where we had another announcer go, horse number 1's ahead, and then horse number 2 and horse number 3. So it wasn't obvious. You couldn't, unless you were like really good and could identify specific horses from their races, you couldn't really know which one it was, and there wasn't that much time to do it. So at least it felt like a real race, and it felt like the sort of thing people couldn't really game. And then what we did is, partway through the race, on the basis of the real statistics of what happens in horse races in the world, we would make an offer, a cash-out offer. So if you bet on horse number 7 and it was in 6th place halfway through the race, we would give you a cash-out offer on the basis of how often does the 6th place horse actually come around to win, right? Same thing if your horse was ahead, or however you had done that in that case. And the other thing we did in this experiment, so we had one activity you could participate in, which was our race night, where you can place a bet. And then we had a competing activity where we coded up the game 2048 as an alternative. So that's a little kind of app-based game. So you could do that as a fun activity instead. So what we found, and we had two different things. So the first thing is we wanted to see what proportion of people would participate in race night. And about 12 to 15% more people participated in race night rather than going to play 2048, right? So that was the first thing that we saw, and that's when they had cash out. So again, we did the same thing, sorry I didn't say that, like we did in the other experiment, where half the people had a cash out world and they knew cash out was available, and half the people, it was just a horse race night and there was no cash out. That was just a regular betting night. So offering them cash out with their horse races increased the likelihood that they're willing to go in to join our race night by about 12 to 15% of people. The other thing we observed was similar to the thing with similar to what we found with the usage with the card game. Now we're looking at how much people were willing to bet when they came to the race night. And again here, it mattered whether you were a high-risk person or a low-risk person. For a high-risk person, it didn't matter, right? You bet very similarly whether you had cash out or not cash out. For the low-risk people, what actually happened is that without cash out, they bet substantially less. With cash out, they bet similar to the high-risk people, right? So what it's doing, this cash out seems to be doing, is it's drawing in, it's getting people who are less likely to bet altogether feel like they could come in and bet, and then getting them to bet at a level that's much more in line with people who would ordinarily be classed as higher risk. And so we see that both in our very kind of artificial lab-based test that we invented, and in this sort of more realistic version that we did with horse racing. And I'll take the next step forward. We did a version with sports betting. And we did this with a real-world sports betting. We did this with the Euros in 2024. So we did this a couple of summers ago when the Euros were on. And so what we did in that case is we had people come in and we offered them to make a bet. And they could place a bet on, the way we did it is we did it before the semifinals. Okay, so you might not remember, probably don't remember, but the Euros in 2024, it was England, France, Spain, and Netherlands were the last 4 teams. England played Netherlands, and Ollie Watkins, who I showed at the beginning, got the goal at the end. Those were the semifinals. So we had people come in and they could place a bet. And again, they were either with cash out or without cash out, and they could place a bet on whichever team that they wanted. And then after the semifinals, before the finals, we offered them the opportunity to cash it out. right? So this was a little bit different because it's between games. It's like in a tournament style, but same idea, right? That we're offering them cash out versus not. And then what we see is that we see more willingness to bet when the cash out was available, right? Again, the same sort of thing. And we get that same sort of effect with the bet size and based on the low risk versus the high risk. So again, the low risk people were, when there was cash out, they were slightly more likely to be willing to bet, and the high risk people were slightly actually in the other direction, right? So again, the same sort of phenomenon, right? Where low risk people seem to be drawn in into this space. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about that sort of new product and cash out. Now I want to talk about a couple of different other biases that you might see with the types of bets that are available. And so one example is you have to imagine a scenario here. Okay, so scenario is you're choosing between two different phones. Okay, and so you're choosing here between an iPhone 16 with 128 gigs or one with 512 gigs. One is obviously much cheaper than the other, 900, 1400, and whether you want one or the other if you're trying to buy a new phone will depend on your price sensitivity, will depend on how much memory you actually think you need, right? So everybody will have a slightly different position where they are based on what they actually want. But the thing that can change that, and when you do this as an experiment, is you can add in a third phone, a relevant alternative, effectively. And so if you add in this third phone, now this third phone is actually quite similar to this one in price, right? So it's just a little bit cheaper than that, $1,350 versus $1,400, but it's much, much worse, right, in terms of, so it's in the middle, it's very close to number B, but it's clearly worse than number B, right? And so what that does, right, is that makes number B look a lot more attractive. And people in this case will end up picking number B a lot more often than if it was just A versus B. It kind of pushes people around. And this is well known in consumer psychology. It gets used a lot in selling products already. You see it on menus even. It's a thing that gets used a lot. And there are betting environments that sort of look like that as well. And so one example of that is something known as early payout. Right, so this is again a type of product where, and here's an example of how it might appear, where instead of betting on a game of who's going to win the game, you can bet on the game, but if your team goes up, in soccer at least, or in football, if your team goes up by 2, then you win the bet anyways. Okay, so like in the most recent World Cup, if you bet on the Argentina-Egypt game, if anybody remembers that, Egypt was winning 2-0 and ended up losing. If you had put a 2-up bet on Egypt, you would have won that anyways because they had won that bet. Now the thing about the 2-up bets is, yes, they pay out a little bit more easily, but they have worse odds, right, as a result. And the way that they're displayed often in the betting apps, not always, but often in the betting apps, is they're actually displayed right next to the match betting. Right? They're on the same screen at the same time, putting that sort of contrast between the slightly worse product and the slightly better product. Suggesting that maybe one of its roles in that sort of ecosystem is perhaps as a decoy. So we set out to test that, and we did this right now also during the recent World Cup. And we did it during the quarterfinals, where we had people bet on the 4 games of the quarterfinals, and they could pay either a 2-up payout or they could take the standard match betting. We used the real odds with real payouts. People genuinely had something at stake. And so this is ongoing. I just got this data this week, so I'm excited. I wanted to share it. It's new, it's fresh, we're thinking about it still. But one of the main things we find is that the 2-up itself is less preferred, right? So it's a little bit like automatic cash out, right? Which isn't as good as real cash out because you don't have the control over that. Except it's automatic cash out with slightly worse odds, right? So it's less preferred. People played a lot less bets on that. But there's one funny feature about this sort of thing, is that you can place, if you've seen on the previous screen, you can also place bets on draws with 2-up, right? The early payout with draws. But that actually doesn't make any sense, right? Because your team can't be up by 2 if it's a draw, right? And in fact, in all the situations, they give you the exact same odds for 2-up with a draw and 2-up regular. Right? That's something which is just the way that they do it. So one of the things we want to see is, okay, this is the exact same product now. The only difference is, right, it's not about a product being slightly different. And then we looked at the number of bets that people placed on the draws, and it was almost three times as many bets people placed on the standard draws versus the 2-up draws. These are the exact same thing, right? But one is being made to look better because of that decoy effect, right? Because of this idea that there's a slightly worse one nearby that's kind of making it look nicer. Okay, the other bias I want to tell you about today is what's known as a framing bias. Now this is ultra famous, and so some of you may have seen it before if you've taken any sort of psychology class and judgment and decision making, but I'll let you look at it anyways. So this is from First Skin Kahneman, 1981, and you can look up there and look at the example over here, right? So it's telling a story of a particular disease outbreak and the types of treatments that are available to you. So you can pick a treatment which is guaranteed to save 200 people, or you can pick a treatment where there's a 1/3 chance that 600 people will be saved and a 2/3 chance that nobody will be saved. So I'll do a show of hands. Who likes, in this case, program A? Who wants to save 200 people for sure? Okay, very nice. And who wants to now gamble and take the chance that you want to, maybe some people will be saved? Okay, very good. This actually matches very nicely the data where the vast majority of people take A. Good. You're a good audience. Thank you. And so that's very nice. Okay, well now I'm going to do another version. You have to play along. And so the opposite version of that is program C and D. So in program C, 400 people will die, guaranteed, no matter what. And program D, with 1/3 chance nobody's going to die, and 2/3 chance 600 people are going to die. Okay, now we're going to do the same game again. I want to see a little show of hands here. Who now is going to take number C? Okay, we got a very small smattering of hands, including Jasper, who's just trying to mess with me. My son is over there. So, program D. Who's going to take program D? Okay, so we got many more who have now shifted over to the other side. And that's exactly what they found in the original paper. It's been replicated in lots of different ways in lots of different formats as a type of framing effect, right? And what you might notice is that these are actually 100% equivalent to one another, right? A and B and C and D, the same things happen. But that doesn't feel the same, right? And you don't act the same, you don't choose the same in that sort of situation. So how does this connect up into, this is obviously a risky choice, but how does it connect into the gambling world? Well, there's a couple of ways. And so one is in lots of jurisdictions, including the UK, and I think in a little bit in Australia too, you have to reveal essentially the cut of the house in different situations. So it's most often with slot machines, but it is in other things as well. And there's two ways you can do it. One of the ways you can tell people about that sort of thing is you can tell them the return to player. Okay, the return to player tells you that there's an average payout of 90%. Okay, so that means 90% of the money goes back to the player. The other way you can tell people is the house edge, right? And you can tell them that the house keeps 10% of the money on every spin, on average. You already might have the intuition. You might have the feeling of, well, actually, one of these sounds very different than the other, even though they're exactly mathematically equivalent to one another. And as you might imagine, we've actually gone out there and looked in the UK. When we did this a few years ago, every single instance that we could find in the wild of this sort of disclosure was the return to player version. There was no instances that we could find of a real world house edge disclosure because you have a choice, right? You can do it one way or the other. We also went out there and we've asked people, we've tried to do a few different things. One of the things we did is we asked people to rate their perceived chances of winning with one type of warning label versus the other. Just like hopefully your intuition aligned with, people think their chances of winning with return to player is much higher. They also understand it much better with house edge, right? So that's another thing, right? That the house edge not only leads you to think that there's a lower chance of winning, but you actually understand what the odds mean much better in that situation. This is so much so that, in fact, this was a picture I took when I was walking around in Lincoln in the UK. I came across one of these betting shops, and in the betting shop window, they were actually advertising the return to player as the way of advertising their product, right? So they're telling you, oh, look, because people misunderstand it so often, right, that and think that it's such a good thing, 97.3. But it actually means that 2.7% of every spin they keep. And so it really felt that's the way that you convey the information. The format of the information can make a very big difference in the types of bets that you place and the types of choices that you make. So I have one more example of that, and this is to another sports betting one. And this is another one that we just ran with the World Cup that we just got the data from not so long ago. Yeah, so for this one, what we did is we were thinking about one of the things that you can do, of course, when you bet on the tournament. A very common thing to do is to bet on the winner of the tournament. Who's going to win the whole thing? And in fact, you already have, these are actually the odds for the next tournament. You can already bet on World Cup 2030. That's something you can bet on 4 years from now. You can actually put money down now, and these are the odds you're going to get to bet on the winner. But there's something funny about that, because especially as the tournament goes on, when you're betting on the winner, there's a hidden accumulator built underneath it, right? So it's actually a compound of many events. In order to win the tournament, you have to qualify from the group stage, win the round of 32, win the round of 16, win the quarterfinals, win the semifinals, and win the finals. That's a lot of things that have to come right in once, right? Seems a lot less probable when I tell it to you like that, rather than thinking about it as winning the tournament. So what we tried to do is we were thinking about this sort of different ways of displaying the information. So in our experiment, what we did is we decided to actually, again, bring people in and offer them the opportunity to bet. And this was in the most recent World Cup. We did it right before the round of 32, right? So we told people you can either bet on the winner with real odds, or you can bet on, and we had two different sports books within our experiment, one which only offered bets on the winner, one which offered bets on the 5-game sequence. And what we found was that there was an about 11% decrease if we unpacked the events. Right? So people were bet a lot, or about 11% less money when you actually told them that they're actually not betting on the winner of the tournament, but they're betting on this crazy sequence of 5 consecutive wins. Right? So again, the way you display the information to people can really shift around what people are betting on. So one question is, okay, so there are some people who can get themselves into trouble with gambling, and some of these things may contribute to that, some of them may not. But one of the things is how can you possibly mitigate that, right? How can you create a safer gambling environment? And one of the most popular things that's been tried, and you'll have seen this all over the place, are safer gambling messages. These are a couple from the UK, but they have new ones in Australia now, like chances are you're about to lose is one of them. They have a sequence of 7 different ones that they rotate every so often. And those are actually better than the UK ones. I'll give credit to that. But there's only so much that those things can accomplish, right? And so what we did is we tried to explicitly evaluate some of these messages. And the one we started with was when the fun stops, which for those of you who are not familiar with it, if you're sitting far enough away, you might only be able to see the word fun. That, on face value, it did not seem like this was actually going to be an effective messaging campaign. But the thing is, a lot of these campaigns, they get created and they get distributed, often by the betting companies, and they're not independently evaluated, they're not created, they're not tested to be something that really genuinely reduces gambling behavior amongst those who might have a problem with it, and produces a safer gambling environment. And so what we tried to do is we went out there and we tested it. We tested it in real time, right, where we put out on a football betting environment. We put it in a roulette environment as well. And we tested whether it made a difference. And we had other control messages and no messages. We had various control groups to try and do that. What I want to show you here is just the results from our looking at when the fun stops. And basically, what you can see here is there's no difference at all. Right? So in terms of the willingness to bet, it made absolutely no difference whether or not we had the message available. It also, if anything, actually led to a slight willingness, if you were going to bet all of your money at the same time. So if anything, there was a backfire effect, right? That it actually made you slightly more likely, the presence of the message, to gamble the whole thing. This was also true in the roulette. This was also true with some of the other messages, like the one that, so after our study, the when the fun stops disappeared and is no longer used in the UK. It was replaced with take time to think is the newer message, which also, when we've run tests with it, similarly had almost no effect, is what we found. The other thing that's for like banner ads and things that are attached to different. In fact, if you saw early on when I showed betting shop windows, you would see that at the bottom of every time, and that's one of the things that they do. Another thing that can be done is more explicitly working with safer gambling videos. And so this is another experiment we did where we looked at 6 different safer gambling videos. However, some of them, you'll notice, were actually made by the gambling companies, by Betfair, by 888, by William Hill. They made the gambling videos. I don't have those ones to show, but basically they were showing people having fun gambling, and at the end it would say something like, don't forget to set a limit, and then see what people would do in that situation. So what we did here is we had people watch the videos, and then we were looking at the click-through rate to a gambling app, right? To see, after watching these videos, did it affect the click-through rate, right? That you would be willing to go into this gambling app that we had created for the experiment. And the main thing that you see, the key results here, is that, first of all, the ones that were made by the betting industry, this is the baseline. So on average, about 6% of people click through, which is what you would expect to see on the internet. People don't tend to click through that often. But if you watched one of these gambling ads, right, which are safer gambling, they're not actually ads, right? So it's not like they're meant to be the opposite, right? These are devised to reduce gambling. It about tripled the rate at which people were willing to click through to the gambling app. So they were effectively acting as ads rather than as deterrents. There was one that seemed to work, and this was one known as the stigma campaign, which cut it by half, right, the click-through rate. I'll show you that just to get a sense of what the type of thing that seems to work. Let's see if it'll actually play. So there's other campaigns that are like this, but they're much more hard-hitting, right? It's not fun, it's not soft, right? And it really gets at that problem gambling experience, right? Talking about what it's like, and can speak to the people who might be suffering from different types of gambling harm. So this transformation of the experience has really, completely transformed the industry. It has made it into a behemoth that you see everywhere. You see ads for it everywhere, and it's really transformed the experience as well. And it's transformed the way that people interact with gambling, the normalization of it, the fact that it's everywhere and always available has really transformed the nature of it. And part of it, and part of the things that exist, tap into some of these sorts of these sorts of psychological biases. So the 2 things I want you to take away from today, apart from more general things, is one, that some of these gambling products and some of these things really tap into these psychological biases. They really push into things that we all experience, we all see, not everybody all the time, but it makes us a little susceptible to these sorts of things. And it's very deeply ingrained, right? It's not something that is easy to just recognize and say, okay, I won't do that anymore, because we feel it, right? We feel that it's more probable in this case. We feel that, oh yeah, in the gain frame we're going to be safe, but if I make it look like a loss, then I'm going to gamble a little bit more, right? So there's lots of these different aspects. And finally, it's pretty hard to mitigate against the potential harms. And that's something I think is an important lesson, that the simple things and the things that often get tried, right, in terms of messaging and telling people do this or do that, doesn't really do much, right? It doesn't move the needle a lot. And what we need in terms of thinking about the future is a much more of a more independently developed evidence base that really goes and tests and develops things that are perhaps more intrusive to really help bring it down. And little messaging, I am a behavioral scientist. It is the sort of thing that I believe in, but sometimes it's not enough. And that might be one of the things to take away from the space. So anyways, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm available for questions.
Really interesting and insightful presentation. We have 10 minutes or so for questions from the room for anyone who's interested in asking them. I might lead off while everyone's getting their thinking caps on. Elliot, I've got a question about the point on the left there. So, an industry that hits on deeply ingrained psychological biases. Is that inherently unethical? The insurance industry also hits on deeply ingrained psychological biases to sell us insurance. Is there a principled way of explaining why betting is harmful and other industries that hit on biases aren't?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't think hitting on biases inherently makes it unethical, because then some might disagree with this, the entire advertising industry, right, also hits on psychological biases, right, in terms of the way that, they get you to buy any product in that sort of way. So I don't think the fact that it's actually tapping into biases makes it immoral or unethical in that sort of way. It's a very challenging thing, right, to kind of figure out where it's okay and when it's not. And often it's very cultural, right? A lot of cultures will think it's fine, right? It's not a problem to gamble. There's also the element that though there are many people who genuinely suffer from gambling harms, many people enjoy it, right? And they're fun, right? They go to Vegas for the weekend. They play cards with their friends. They go to the casino, right? This is something that they really like. And so I'm always a little hesitant to kind of use terms around ethics and morals in this case, because it's stigmatized. In fact, that's actually what they called that, the stigma campaign. You don't want to stigmatize people either, right? I'm not there to judge, right, what people are doing, but I do want to, right, try to use what we know in terms of, psychology, in terms of behavioral science, in terms of how things work, to make it less likely that those who might be susceptible to harm will move in that sort of direction.
Thank you for the presentation. Just a quick question. You're talking about the cash out rates and so forth during live events. At what level do they operate? Are they sort of market-based, or if an app, for example, knows your past betting preferences, are the algorithms more at an individual level?
So that's a good question, and I don't know the inside of how it's set, right? So it's probably different at different operators. It tends to be the case that I don't know, we haven't really tested. I guess you could test it by having two different people placing the same bets at the same time and then looking at what the cash out offers that are made to them. I mean, that's one of the ways to get at that sort of question. I think it's mostly statistical, right? That the offer is made at a certain percentage of expected value. Now, there was a study a few years ago. This is a little different. What you're talking about is as the game is going on and as it's developing, so I don't think it's often market-based. I think it is very much statistical. There are instances where it could be, right? It could be that a operator stands to lose on a particular round and is therefore offering cash out offers to kind of buy back their bets. But the thing that is noticeable is often it's very discounted compared to what the actual expected value is. And in fact, in most situations, you're better off, right, as a consumer, hedging your bet. So instead of taking the cash out offer, the smart thing to do is actually to place another bet on the other side, right? And then you can guarantee yourself more money that way. And in fact, there was a big study, this was about, I guess 11 years ago now, Leicester won the premiership in the UK. And they were very long odds at the beginning of the year. I believe it was 500 to 1 odds, maybe even 5,000 to 1 odds. And there were people who stood to win £500,000 at the end of the season. And as the season went on, and they were in first place in March, and towards the end of March, the companies who stood to lose a lot of money in this case started to make substantial cash out offers to their customers. And so there are newspaper records of people taking £92,000, £107,000, £83,000 as their cash out offers, which are huge amounts of money. The study, what it went out there and did is it actually collected those newspaper articles and then went and took the odds on that day of what would have happened if you had placed the bet on all 19 other teams that day. How much money could you have guaranteed yourself in that situation? And in fact, it turns out that those people left tens of thousands of pounds on the table, either because they didn't know that that's something they could do, they didn't necessarily have the capital in order to be able to make that happen, right? But so the cash out offers, right, are heavily discounted very often, right? That there's a significant margin, often a much bigger margin than the original bet. Because the original bet has a kind of open market to it, right? If you're putting a bet on a game, there are lots of operators, and there are even websites that collate all the odds, and you can compare where do you want to bet, right? Sometimes you could even find differences that you could take advantage of. But that's much closer to being almost even. The cash out offer is one-on-one. right? You have your bet, and they're making you that offer, and you could decide to take it or not take it, right? And it's dynamically changing, so I think that there's an element to that, but I don't think it's market-based. There are other things like Betfair markets and other things where there is a market for trading bets, but the cash out is more statistical. Whether it's personalized, that's a good question. If it isn't yet, with the new technologies and AI interfaces and all sorts of things like that, I bet it will be soon.
Thank you for the great talk. I wanted to ask, actually, what I was thinking about when you were talking about the cash out was game shows, because I feel like game shows have actually been doing this for a really long time, where they offer people to stop early and take a small cash payment. So I was just wondering, is it the same way? Are they using that as their model, or is it a very different approach that they're taking?
So I would think that it's actually quite similar, right? In that sort of way where you have, now the game shows are a little bit different in that you haven't placed a bet initially, right? So you don't have anything at stake in that sort of way. You do a little bit, but it's all wins, right? It's more about how much are you going to win? Are you going to win a little bit more, or are you going to win a little bit less? Cash out could actually go both different ways. The example I gave with the Australia one, right? The team went ahead, right? So they were ahead. It could have been, right, on the other hand, what would happen if Australia was losing 1-0, right? Then the offer would have been smaller. They might have offered you back 35 cents, right? A very small amount. So it goes in both directions, right? So cash out actually can be both when you're ahead and when you're behind, which again offers you a degree of control, both over how much you win, but also gives you some control over how much you lose, right? So if you're worried, oh, I don't have to lose my whole bet, I can get some of it back, right? I can recover some of my loss, oftentimes to just place another bet. But it does give you that sort of bi-directional control. So I think it's related to that sort of game show idea, but it's a little bit different because you have your own money at stake, and it goes both ways, right? It can go both up and it can go down. And in the game shows, I mean, I guess you have a little bit of a reference point where you are at the start of it, but it's very, I mean, a lot of these things are similar in exactly that sort of thing. Thank you.
Do you think there's any correlation between the cost of living now and how the market's growing in terms of gambling?
So, yes, I would think so. That the fact that cost of living is going up, people feel poorer, and perhaps feel there's more of a draw, or more of a need perhaps, and that's one of the things that drives people into gambling in the first place, is the sense that they need to, right? Or else, right? There's an aspiration level, right? That it draws you along, that you need to get a certain amount. You don't have enough to live, you don't have enough to buy a house, you don't have enough to do what you need to do, that makes gambling more attractive, right? Even though it's actually, on average, a loss-making proposition, right? That, most people don't win, right? We know that already. In some ways, the right way to do that is to start a gambling company and be on the other side. I think absolutely that does seem to be the case. And we know that there is definitely a correlation between level of deprivation and betting, right? So we see it in the UK. They've done studies looking at the frequencies of betting shops versus the poverty level in a given area. And the poorer the area, the more betting shops that are set up in exactly that area. So that makes sense that if broadly the cost of living is increasing, therefore people feel poorer, right? They're more likely to take on or to engage with these sorts of gambling products. So yeah, thank you.
All right, that takes us past the top of the hour, so please join me again in thanking Elliot for his presentation, and please accept this as a token of our gratitude. Thank you. I want to make a point of thanking also the team at the School of Psychological Sciences who've put this event together, so Celia, Mairead, and Gemma, as well as Elizabeth, the hub coordinator, who was instrumental in making this happen. And thank all of you for coming out this evening and for your attention. And I believe there's refreshments being served in the foyer as we speak. So thank you again.
Thank you.